coming. It's amazing to see you all here. What a great crowd. Amazing energy. My name is Matthew Souls. I'm an associate professor of architecture at the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at UBC. Tonight's event is part of our spring event series. This is the 4th event of 6 this term. I would like to just plug our next upcoming event. It is on March 5th at 6 p.m. So that's Wednesday at 6 p.m. And it's one of what we're doing this term, very exciting, we think, what are faculty roundtable discussions. So it's where a group of 4 faculty from Sala come and give sort of 7-minute micro presentations on stuff that's related to their most cutting-edge research and ideas. So it's a kind of snapshot of really exciting things that are happening out at our school. The theme, each one has a different theme. So the one on March 5th is called Spatial Justice Futures. We have some really exciting faculty that are really questioning how does the world become a more just and equitable place through architecture and landscape architecture. So if you're interested in that topic, please come out and join us. It is free, like all our events. We ask that you RSVP just so we know how many are coming. You can go onto our website and find that RSVP link. Please do that. And it's on campus, so some of our events are here, some of our events are at Robson Square. This one's out at the UBC Point Grey campus in the Loop Institute, which, if you haven't been there, is designed by Arthur Erickson, and it's in we use a very nice room in that building. Okay, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish nations. So, as people who are interested in the built environment that literally inhabits the ground, works with the ground, I think it's extra important for us to always consider and reflect on why we do land acknowledgement. So with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Susan Harrington, who is a professor of landscape architecture at Sala. Susan, come on up.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'd like to introduce Marc Treib. He is a professor of architecture emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of dozens of books on architects and landscape architects. I think it's safe to say that he really spearheaded the profession and historians to look at modern landscape architecture back in the 1990s and started a whole movement of people discovering modern landscape architecture, and won tons of awards, including the Guggenheim. And he's been a real friend of Sala's, giving lectures, coming to reviews, and of course sharing his book launch on Noguchi with us tonight. So let's please welcome Marc Treib.
How's the sound? Good in the back? Way in the back? Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Sala and Inform for arranging this evening, particularly Matthew, who we just saw, and Daniel Rohr, who's the chair of the landscape department at UBC. And also Inform. This is the 3rd time I've been here. It's amazing. Invite me back. But it's just an amazing, I've never been in any city where you had a store, basically, that's so interested in the profession and supporting the profession in various things. So, Isamu Noguchi. Until about the 1980s, I really didn't know much about Isamu Noguchi. My education had been in architecture, and that's what I was teaching, mostly design and drawing, at the University of California, Berkeley, where I was until about 15 years ago. I didn't have, had an interest in art, but I knew nothing about landscape architecture and really no interest in it. That kind of came later. But a good friend of mine, my next door neighbor, Ron Herman, was a landscape architect, and he was asked to be a guest editor of an issue of Process magazine. You remember, they did monographs on recent California landscape design. For some reason, he asked me to collaborate. I can't remember exactly why, but it could be because he really didn't write very well. And we had collaborated, co-authored the book on the gardens of Kyoto, a guidebook, which is still in print 43 years later, actually, which is good. Made a fortune, not. Right? So I agreed to join him, and sometime later I was going to Southern California for a conference, and Ron asked me to visit this place that in photographs looked pretty interesting. It's called California Scenario. It was a plaza, a garden. It was really hard to say exactly what it was, but it was by this guy, Isamu Noguchi. Ron thought it looked interesting. Well, when I got there, it was summer, it was midday, the sun was high, and it was almost unbearably hot. The gardens formed, looked a little bit interesting, but I wondered why this place seemed so inhospitable, and I left very unimpressed. My impression was radically changed on the second visit about a year later. Unlike midday, it was now late afternoon, just after a rainstorm, probably in the spring when there's still some rain in California. And the majority of the garden had been thrown into deep shade by the low sun. Gradually, from behind the cloud layer, light began to beam intensely into the space, creating deep shadows. It transformed the garden into sculpture. In contrast to that previous arid torture I had experienced on my first visit, this really was gripping visual theater, and I thought, maybe there's something here after all. That night, I returned to the space, and my changed opinion was confirmed. Life and shapes within the space appeared as high drama. My problem was that way back then, like many people, I thought a garden had to be about flowers and shrubs and trees. I never thought a garden could be so barren as it was down there in Costa Mesa, or maybe minimal would be a more appropriate adjective. I really wasn't ready for it, like many people aren't. Noguchi had a different idea about gardens. He wanted to create sculptures in the form of a garden, or gardens conceived as sculpture. Of less interest to him were all those things that landscape architects have to go through to create gardens and parks and plazas, which he called, in an interview working with his assistant, who he left all this stuff, he called those things hypocrisies and details. We call it normal practice. But enough about him, what about me? Over the years, as I learned more about the projects, I gave lectures and wrote about Noguchi's landscapes that I had visited. And from 1992 to 1994, I was lucky to receive both Fulbright and Guggenheim fellowships, and I was able to support my study of modern landscape architecture in 5 European countries. Since my then wife was French, we chose Paris as a base. And I started to spend more time as she was working in the Le Corbusier Foundation, and eventually got interested in one project and did a book, this book, on Le Corbusier's multimedia Philips Pavilion for the 1958 Brussels World Fair. But I also visited a lot of French gardens of various eras, including the garden at UNESCO House that was completed in 1958 through designs by none other than Isamu Noguchi. While the upper terrace, which you see on the left, interested me as a constellation of sculptural forms, I thought the lower garden was actually more provocative, and I spent many hours in the archives trying to find anything I could about the commissioning and the making of the garden in the minutes of the art committee or even those of the General Assembly. I found very, very little. And I spent a lot of time in the garden itself. With additional research on the garden and about Noguchi, a book called Noguchi in Paris was published 2003. My interest in the sculptor's landscapes endured, and I continued to visit or revisit the landscape projects that he always referred to as gardens, no matter what their materials were. Having my travel curtailed by COVID-19 and forced to stay at home, either here or in Berkeley, boosted by the misplaced idea that I already had completed the research, I finally got around to writing the book on Noguchi's gardens, in addition to 2 other books I had no plan to write on other subjects. Like the Lord, COVID worked in many mysterious ways. Noguchi looked at landscape design, spatial and formal art, and from his earliest projects from the 1930s to the works made at the end of his life, he used different ideas to create and construct some remarkable places. Object, space, and landform cohered in his gardens, and those properties will recur in my discussion of some of his most outstanding spatial projects. When trying to explain Noguchi's work, his biographers often like to stress, certainly they cite, his parentage, which was of mixed origin. His mother was an Irish-American who served as the editor for his father, that was how they met, who was a Japanese poet living in New York and writing in English. The alienation and the ambiguity, however, was furthered by Yone Noguchi, his father's departure back to Japan even before Isamu was born. And there's a lot there in biography which I'm not going to go into. Over time, Noguchi's sculpture went through many changes. Changes of material, changes of forms, changes of attitudes. He returned to stone in his later years. In his youth, he had apprenticed for a short time with Constantin Brancusi in Paris in the late 1920s. Throughout this continual evolution, he persisted in creating some spaces that he called gardens. In 1933, Noguchi proposed his first 2 landscapes, a proto-earthwork called Monument to the Plow, which you see above, to commemorate the tool that facilitated the cultivation of the American plains, and a contoured relief called Play Mountain below. His shift to works at such radically different scales derived from this evolving social conscience that was coming onto him. He thought that art was too detached from normal life, and he was trying to develop art projects, giant sculptures, that would somehow engage more people freely and being freely accessible. For Play Mountain, Noguchi reformed terrain as stepped or swirling mounds and concavities, forms that were highly centrifugal in directing the views outward and also movement beyond the boundaries of the playground. In contrast, the Monument to the Plow was proposed as a softly sloping pyramid of rather vast dimensions. Each of its sides was supposed to be about 400 meters. And each of those were to be planted with new agricultural methods promulgated by the Department of Agriculture as a way of stemming the erosion that was endemic to the Midwestern US. Here, the geometric regularity of the pyramid structured the sowing of the crops, but the definition of that form would actually erode and be softened as the plants matured. There are some real mistakes in how that would be planted, however, but won't go into that. So for Noguchi, openness and closure, like the geometric and the organic, were never irreconcilable. To the contrary, as a basic human construct, he believed that geometry infused a sense of human origins into contemporary thought and art. These mixtures of natural, geometric, and the fabricated were also endemic to Japanese tea aesthetics, as it happens, and they, over the years, characterized almost all of Noguchi's landscape designs. 2 proposals that followed in the early 1940s furthered Noguchi's investigations of ground form. What you see here is called a sculpture to be seen from Mars, 1947. It first appears as an unremarkable geometricized face. In fact, the model itself is about 1 foot square. Until we come to understand that the nose alone was supposed to measure 1.5 kilometers along its long base. So this was a big piece. It also retrieved the pyramidal form that was in the monument to the plow. In contrast, the 1941 contoured playground clearly illustrates the modeling of an earthen surface for human activity. The almost haptic movement of its softly shaped form suggests a correspondence between the sculpture's surfaces and their intended human use. Despite the artist's dedication and hopes, however, all these works remain unrealized, ultimately left as plaster maquettes, some of which were then cast in bronze and displayed in subsequent years as sculpture in and of themselves. Now, if Noguchi's proposal for monumental land works were never realized, Martha Graham's invitation to produce sets for her modern dance company instigated the design of spaces in which Noguchi could now accommodate the human body in movement. Although his means were restricted and the constraints rather severe in terms of portability, erecting, striking them after performance, Noguchi welcomed these occasions to design at full scale. First produced during the mid-1930s, he kept the constituent elements of the sets to a minimum, relying instead on the dynamic relationships of the dancers as they moved around and among them. This acceptance of sparseness and suggestion, rather than blatant statement, recalled the austerity of the Japanese No theater, which Noguchi openly acknowledged. Noguchi's set for the 1935 production of Frontier, his most distilled theatrical design, relied on a single draped rope to distinguish the space of the theater into front and back, into here and there, into audience and stage. Inspiration may have derived again from Japan, from the rice straw rope, the shimenawa, which is strung across doorposts or the posts of a tori at Shinto shrines and renewed each year. So from these lessons that he learned in theater, he took them outdoors. Among them, the elevated comprehension of space and its definition, the affinities among sculptural elements, and the connections linking form and space with the human body and its movement. Collectively, if not literally, these experiences would inform Noguchi's making of landscapes. Now, despite his having evolved as an artist rooted in Western modernism, Noguchi's affinity with Japanese aesthetics were acute and influential. His travels through Japan included visits to the classic gardens of Kyoto, where the quiet perfection of the Katsura Villa, the condensed power of the Ryoanji stone garden, and the borrowed scenery at Ensuji Temple all touched him very deeply. However, of all the gardens he visited in Kyoto, it was the hybrid forms of the late 15th century Gingakuji, the garden of the Silver Pavilion, that most actively captured his imagination. The garden's conical mound and table of raked sand reflected the complex simplicity of the design, a quality to which he aspired in his own landscapes. These would later appear in modified form, in fact, in several of his works, as would the basic lesson of a figure or an object set against a sculptured ground. Around 1950, Noguchi was commissioned to create the garden for the new headquarters for the Japanese edition of the Reader's Digest in Tokyo, which was then being designed by emigre architect Antonin Raymond. Raymond's building design used an innovative structure of concrete and steel to structure spaces sheathed within walls of glass, possibly the first use of these materials after the war, when there were still restrictions on building materials. Uncompromisingly modernist in its idiom, the architecture was nonetheless respectful of its sensitive site on the edge of the imperial palace compound, which is why the building was restricted in height to 2 floors. Reader's Digest Garden was the first Noguchi landscape to be realized. Its design balanced the practical with the imaginary. Wisely, he used earth excavated for the building foundations and drainage to form hillocks and ridges, while appropriating underground springs as the sources for his water features. These earth forms were joined by the freely meandering stream, and it gets more complicated than that, with trees and rocks serving as foils to the geometric purity of some of these earthen mounds. In retrospect, he stated that in working on the Reader's Digest project, he acquired pragmatic knowledge, dedication, and a sensibility, learning an enormous amount by what he called working in the mud with Japanese gardeners. Following his return from the United States, Noguchi was commissioned to design 4 courtyards and a terrace for the new suburban campus of Connecticut General Life Insurance outside Hartford and Bloomfield, and they were completed in 1957. Gordon Bunshaft, who you may be familiar with, was the design principal for the New York Architectural Office of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and he was the lead architect on the project. In these spaces, Noguchi wed sculptural vocabulary with traditional Japanese garden design, composing a series of inner courts in which a carpet of gravel or grass prevailed, thereafter articulated by skillfully positioned patches of moss, grass, a shrub, or perhaps even a Japanese maple. Although these were tinged with the breath of Japan, the vocabulary of the courtyards were actually closer to the biomorphism characteristic of surrealism in paintings such as those by Juan Miró or Yves Tanguy, or actually in Noguchi's own sculptures of the 1940s. The Connecticut General Courtyard served primarily as light courts. You really didn't enter them on a daily basis, and they were for visual interest. In contrast, the Employees' Terrace, which as you can see is a checkerboard of gravel, lawn, and granite paving, were accessible to all, whether executives, office staff, or even visitors. In reality, the Connecticut General Gardens, though, had very little of a third dimension. They were really giant bas-reliefs with their terrain largely level, and they only suggested rather than delivered any of the movement of Noguchi's earlier playground proposals. After the Connecticut General Landscape, Noguchi worked with Gordon Bunshaft on several other projects in the 1960s, including 2 of his best works. The courtyard for the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale University was geometric at its base and executed in one material, easy spec, right? White Vermont marble. To Noguchi, the torus, the ring, symbolized the sun and its energy. The pyramid was the earth and stability, and the cube on edge represented chance. Whether anyone would ever get that or not is highly unlikely. This application of symbolism was actually quite rare in his gardens, and you wondered, in fact, why it was even proposed in this one. The courtyard, paved with its constellation of elements, are all linked by these radiating lines inscribed in the painting, and they're done with precision and perfection. And really, there are 4 elements to this garden, the 4th one being the paving. It is not a neutral surface. It heightens the presence of the objects while also joining them. Although designed at basically the same time, the Chase Manhattan Bank Court in New York is diametrically opposite in form and feeling. It literally turns Japanese tradition on its head. Traditionally, you're supposed to bury a rock about 2/3 of its height, whatever, into the earth to look like it really grew from it, whatever. As you see, Noguchi elevated the rocks above, or either rested on the surface, or they're even elevated above, as we can see, not in this one, but one of the other ones. So we have this mixture of the granite sets that form the undulating ground plane, these large rocks, which were actually brought from Japan, animated water and pools, but those were seasonal. It's a dry courtyard during the winter months. In Jerusalem, oops, oh, I think we've missed something. Yeah, okay, it'll come back, we'll work it out. We've now moved on to Paris. I was doing so well. Here we are. Okay. Moving to Paris. Noguchi's original charge for the delegates' patio, which was adjacent to the lobby of the UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and something cultural organization, he produced these conic volumes that could also serve as seating. This was, he often took a commission and expanded it, which was not normally a problem until he wanted more fee to cover what he had done. So as you can see here, rather than installing a single sculpture like the other artists commissioned for the UNESCO building, he created kind of a constellation that fills the terrace. These seats, which again suggest an influence of Brancusi, are made out of cast concrete. And if you look in the back, you'll see these clusters of rocks that could also be used for seating and plants as well. The shortfall of the required square footage in the office space in this building being erected, and I'm not going into the details of it, it was designed by a triumvirate of Marcel Breuer from the US, Bernard Zeifers from France, and Pierluigi Nervi from Italy. And it was done as a Y in plan and was going to be 8 stories tall. Well, even during construction, the agency was growing so quickly that they found there wouldn't be enough space of their needs. So they had to build an annex building on the, basically fronting the street, separated from the main headquarters. They asked Noguchi, would you like to design the path to connect the delegates' patio to the annex? He said, sure. And this is what he came up with, which is a sloping ramp, since it's a level below, paralleled by this water channel. But he didn't stop there. He said, well, you don't have an assigned use for this land on the other side of the path. Suppose we make a garden there. And they said, that sounds interesting, but you got to raise the money for it. So he actually was a great entrepreneur and eventually raised the vast sum of $35,000. And they went to work on the garden. And he planned to stay in Paris only a couple of months and ended up staying the better part of the year as a way of realizing this. Eventually, the garden was sponsored by Japan, who also sent a team of gardeners to help him with the selection of plants and the rocks. Gardeners headed by someone named Toima Sano, who is from a 14-generation garden-making firm. And Sano and Noguchi often banged heads together because Noguchi was thinking as a sculptor, a Western sculptor, and Sano, of course, was dealing with Japanese tradition. This is the garden shortly after it was completed. As you see, the forms are biomorphic. Looks a little like Snoopy, I thought. And this is a raised plateau in the middle of the garden. I don't think he was very good at engaging the space around this shape. It's more or less using it almost as if it was a picture frame. But you can see it encompasses areas that are paved with sets. They then descend into a pond and then end with this gravel at the bottom of the picture, which is at the foot of the retaining wall supporting the delegates' patio. There's a lot to say about this stuff, but we're going to move on. And here you can see the gravel area, which is against the retaining wall. Actually, Noguchi's weak spot is Achilles' plant, if you call it, it's not a heel, was that he really didn't know how to use vegetation. And that was furthered by the fact UNESCO really didn't know how to care for vegetation. If they had had Japanese gardeners on site, it would be a different story. But the vegetation neither reinforces nor acts against. Oops. And you can see here how large these trees have grown. Admittedly, it's a much more pleasant place to be than it was in the early years. But sculpturally, the presence has been reduced, except you see it in moments. Now it's heavily used by people who want to smoke, like a lot of his projects, in fact. Okay, now we're in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, some years later, Noguchi created a sculpture garden for the new Israel Museum, taking shape on what was called the Hill of Tranquil Habitation. Good luck. There, the architects Al Mansfeld and Dora Gad had planned the museum, as you see in the upper part, as a series of pavilions that were adjusted to the needs of the particular galleries and the contours of the site. This, of course, was in the air at that time, the Metabolist in Japan, Aldo van Eyck Orphanage in Amsterdam, etc., etc. This idea of an agglomerative structure rather than a single form. You can see here, because the hill was so sloped, Noguchi proposed, you can see only four of the 5 cusps of large retaining walls made out of the stone from the site that would be used as retaining walls to create not really level, but nearly level surfaces for the display of sculpture, which would be set purposely. You can see they're inclined so that you'd see them against the sky, which is very wise because there's been a lot of development around it. And had you not been looking up, you would have been seeing these things against some pretty crappy architecture. And here is the plants that matured. This was taken by a friend about 1.5 years ago. You can see the pathways leading down there to these terraces. Actually, that volume is the top of a James Turrell sky space that they kind of snuck into it. Not a bad solution, actually, but kind of undermines the idea. For sculptures that are more closely closer to human scale, he created this zone between those open terraces and the museums, which, as you can see, played with, students never use that word, incorporated walls of various configurations that would create spaces that are more conducive to viewing things, more intimate sculpture. Many of these were concrete. As you can see, the triangle there was faced with the same limestone used to veneer the buildings. Now, it was 17 years after the completion of the Jerusalem project before Noguchi constructed what I think is his true masterwork, the California scenario, which you're looking down at here. It's in Costa Mesa, California, south of Los Angeles. The developer, Henry Segerstrom, who was a real patron of the arts, invited the sculptor to realize a plaza in conjunction with the construction of 2 new office towers to be built on a site adjacent to the 405 motorway, unfortunately, and Segerstrom's own gigantic South Coast Plaza shopping center. The 2 reflective towers set at right angles, which you see here, and behind the parking garage, that space in between is where a California scenario would be built. Within these boundaries, Noguchi formulated the design as an exegesis on the ecologies of California, a carefully designed spiritual expression of the mountains, the Central Valley, and the deserts, as well as citing the state's natural resources and their use. Sculpture and space, once again, coincided. The plaza collected sculptural objects like the stacked rocks of a piece called The Spirit of the Lima Bean, which was the first crop grown by the Segerstrom family. They are still the world's greatest producer of lima beans, for those of you who take a note of those things. And Segerstrom wanted at least one piece that would be signed by Noguchi as a sculpture. as opposed to the overall work as sculpture. So we see zones like the High Sierras in the back there with redwoods and that inclined plane, originally planted with wildflowers, but that didn't work out because the Southern California climate does not match that of the High Sierras at 5,000 feet. So it is now an irrigated lawn, but it works equally well. There's the desert land that's marked by a plethora of cacti, and also what's called the water source, which is making reference to the flow of water from the snow melt in the Sierras and coming down and feeding the stream that goes through the space. Obviously, the reference here is to the astronomical observatories of Jai Singh in India, either New Delhi or Jaipur. The 4-story high walls of the parking garage with the trees, which have now matured, this was finished 1982, are really what grab you when you first walk into the space. But as you go through it, different things are revealed. Here we have the termination of the meandering stream in this flat pyramid, which is intended to illustrate water and land use. The desert land, which is probably the most cleverly designed of all the things, this dome is actually, it's a concrete dome. I mean, it was really designed by a landscape architect named Ken Kameyer, who was really responsible for a lot of the detailing of this. Noguchi worked at small scale and then kind of turned it over to his partner, Seiji Sadao, or to other collaborators to work out all those hypocrisies and details and things. And this was, I'm not going to go into the story, it's in the book, but it's incredibly brilliant how you could create a shallow dome of the desired contour, plant the cacti and Palo Verde exactly where you want them, and have it be stable and not washed away in the rain. Very interesting story. And then, of course, in the evening, it's mystical when the illuminated walls of the parking garage softly repel the white light that's cast upon them. And as people walk and run between the lights and the walls, you've got these gigantic shadow images, so it also can be a shadow place. It's really quite wonderful at night. And in fact, at night I've seen all kinds, well, not all kinds, but a number of different uses, including art students who are sketching. As we know, it's easier to draw a profile than it is the full surfaces. Theatrical performances, and even one time the awards dinner for the local AIA chapter, the Architects Association, because they could project, they turned off the lights on one of the walls and they projected the winning designs on the wall. Okay, in terms of climatic management and physical comfort, it has to be admitted that California's scenario has many shortcomings. It's unbearably hot in the summer months, or almost any time when the sun's high. And there are very few places to sit within the space, much less sit in shade. On a visit some years ago, because of these shortcomings, I arrived around midday and found caterers setting up for a wedding reception. They brought in tables on which to eat and chairs on which to sit. They brought tents to provide some shade, and they even had small carpets you can see of AstroTurf to naturalize the stone surfaces and create a lawn. Of course, I was appalled. I was also pissed off I couldn't take more photos. But after a little while, I thought, oh, maybe this isn't a bad idea. Maybe this is a good idea, in fact. Why does every landscape have to be comfortable and provide amenity all the time? Can't its primary role be one about edification, or enjoying the forms, or watching the shadows change, or how it is between day and night? And when you need comfort, bring it in. And even better, take it away when you don't need it anymore. So I had a real change of heart there. In 1988, which was the last year of Noguchi's life, the mayor of Sapporo, Japan, commissioned him to convert a wasteland of urban garbage on the edge of the city into a major park, or even better stated, a work of art. The processes of deposit and reformation had been underway for almost 10 years, and when Noguchi received his invitation, there had been a certain pastoral vision that had already been the guiding principle. The brief requested a mountain, that was in the program. We want a mountain, okay, and an amphitheater, as well as baseball fields, a track, and other sports grounds and facilities for active recreation. Always concerned with play and the development of children, Noguchi dedicated the park to them. And just briefly, L is that conical mound, that kind of there, Mount Fuji, which is developed out of spoil. K is the amphitheater. C is, you'll see Play Mountain, which he retrieved from his 1933 project, showing that you should never throw any items. Don't erase those files. G is large ring that surrounds this large fountain. B is called Moire Beach because Sapporo is landlocked. He created this little pond with sand around its shores so that the kids can go to the beach during the summer. And then the whole area to the right, which is filled with planting of trees, is primarily, and each of those voids in the forest are filled with play equipment. And the kids are encouraged to move from one of these to the other. Noguchi worked almost in the manner of a Japanese gardener, where you set the primary stones in a garden and then position the secondary stones in the plants in relation to them. He worked very shortly, less than a year, to design this. This was early days. The trees now have really grown up to the point where they're defining spaces. This was taken from the top of Play Mountain, where this almost got blown off by the strong winds. But it's a gigantic scale. Here we have Play Mountain. You may remember this was the original project for it. Used pretty much as it was, but of course in the original, and that's the problem with all the early projects, we don't know what materials they're made of, how you stabilize the earth, even what the dimensions are, what's around the site. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. So here's the amphitheater, which is an inclined plane. And then there was a glass pyramid, which wasn't part of Noguchi's scheme, but was added so that there are indoor facilities. Remember, this is up in Hokkaido, where there's a lot of snowfall and a lot of snow. We received one of the playgrounds early on before the planting matured. And because Noguchi died in process, the people that carried it out, his assistant, the Sapporo Park Department, a firm called Architect 5, were kind of constantly looking at Noguchi's stuff to see what could be appropriated. This is called Playscapes. It was actually built in Atlanta in 1976. And a lot of those forms then were brought to, rehearsed, and recreated in Sapporo because they didn't know what to do. Now, landscape architects have acknowledged and at times appreciated the formal invention and use of materials in Noguchi's landscape. At other times, they've disparaged their performance in addressing the trio of social, physical, and environmental criteria that we normally try to address. In terms of performance, that criticism is totally valid. But we need to keep in mind that Noguchi made no attempt to create landscapes that functioned in the way common to landscape architecture. Instead, he wanted to create artworks, spatial sculptures at human scale, at times to be entered physically, at other times to perceive only through the eyes. Gardens that would reside more in the mind than in the body. Now, a little bit about the book. When trying to tackle such a complex career marked by an enormous body of work, my primary challenge was how to structure the book. how to establish the link between his object sculptures and his gardens, how to approach them, which work should be included and which neglected. I made no attempt to include everything he ever did. That would be impossible. Many projects had been left only in sketches. Others were more sculptures in gardens rather than gardens as sculpture. The book is comprehensive, but it's not absolutely complete. In the chapters which present the major works, I tried to focus on issues that shaped the design as a basis for explaining what might have been his thought process. Speculation, of course, on my part. But what about the availability of photos and other images? Over the years, I've extensively photographed Noguchi's sculptures and gardens, but most of them were 35mm negatives or color slides. Some of you may remember what those are. Fortunately, the Isamu Noguchi Garden Museum in Long Island City has an extensive archive, and they had a wonderful archivist who was really, really helpful. She's moved on to another job now. But almost all of these were only black and white. Most of them were taken by Noguchi himself shortly after the completion of the project, so they don't show what had happened over 50 or 60 or 70 years in some cases. And this is one of those, again, for Reader's Digest. You know, not the world's best photographs either. So there was no money for professional photography, of course, or anything else for that matter. I mean, it's all self-funded. Immodestly, I think the photos I took are actually rather good. And more importantly, they show the projects as I wanted. The book has a hybrid structure. There are thematic chapters on subjects such as landform, gardens within bounds, the use of water, Noguchi's relation to Japanese aesthetics, and an evaluation of his work set against his own personal landscape in Mure, Japan. The monographic chapters cover the UNESCO Garden, the Billy Rose Art Garden in Jerusalem, California Scenario, and the Moynihan Park. As is my wont, I designed the book. Again, no money for a designer. And this is the 7th or 8th book I've done with Oro Editions, who have been wonderful to work with. A plug for them. In particular, their chief editor and operating officer, Jake Anderson, and publisher, Gordon Goff. Their production standards are always high, which is why so many in architecture and landscape architecture choose to publish with them. Also, they'll take almost anything. In closing, 2 questions informed the writing of the book. First, I'm neither an art historian nor a landscape architect. I'm a historian of architecture and landscape architecture, a little bit art, and I approach the subject critically. Art historians to this point have presented Noguchi's landscapes only as form, without criticism. I look at them as complete environments, and it has to be said, as I've already said, that a number of the gardens have their shortcomings, and I felt it was important to cite them. The second question raises the issue as to whether or not we can regard a garden, a plaza, a park, as an artwork, rather than just as a design or a work of landscape architecture. Personal evaluation of Noguchi's designs ranks the Banki Library, Chase, Manhattan Bank, Chase Plaza 1, California Scenario, and in the middle at the bottom, which I haven't talked about, the Domonken Photography Museum in Sakata, Japan, from 1982. Yoshio Taniguchi's breakthrough work, as it happens. I would then say UNESCO and Jerusalem are a little bit behind the key ones. And as a posthumous work, Mourning in the Park has to be evaluated on other terms. But are these gardens really art? Perhaps one should leave the last word to Isamu Noguchi himself. In the closing of his guidebook to the Isamu Noguchi Garden Museum in New York, he offered a simple measure that's also applicable, I think, to any landscape. He wrote, "Call it sculpture if it moves you so," or perhaps a garden. Thank you. there any questions? Or comments? Received comments? Yes? Or the exercise? Do we need the mic?
There's so many people.
Just shout.
I'll shout. Did the earthwork artists of the 60s and 70s know about Noguchi's work in the 30s and 40s with all these big landforms?
I mentioned it in there. I don't know. I've never seen any reference either by them or the question was whether the 60s and 70s earthworks artists knew about Noguchi's work. I rather doubt it. I mean, not the monument to the plow. They may know the playgrounds because those maquettes were on display at the museum. But the museum came really, I think, late 80s or 90s. So I would say no, and that's he's preceding them by 30 or 40 years. But he had a running battle with Robert Moses. And anyway, there's a whole chapter on the project he did with Nui Khan for a playground in New York that went through 5 iterations and ultimately was shot down, probably just as well. It got overly monumental. Others? This side, maybe? You have to balance.
Marc,
You're a little slow. I thought you'd be first.
following on from Susan, you know, I came to Noguchi from seeing the stage works, you know, stage sets, especially for ballet. And I guess my conception of Noguchi was formed by his designing environments for performance. I have to admit, after seeing this, he still seems really interested in performance, especially dance. And you can look at those environments as environments that you would dance through. The movement of the body through the space seems to be essential to their formation. Do you have any sense of that?
There was a give or take with Martha Graham. There's something in her autobiography where she said, I called to someone and said, come with me now, we're going to go to the Museum of Modern Art. And she wanted them to look at this early sculpture by Giacometti called The Palace at 2 a.m. And it's a framework with objects in it. She says, this is what I'm looking for. And he would then go back to his studio. He said he never spent more than 2 weeks on any set. And he would design it, and then she would review it and sometimes modify the dance she had in mind in relation, or at other times probably asked him to modify things. But there are a lot of constraints on these things because Martha Graham had a traveling troupe. They had to be knocked down immediately after performance and all, so they're really crappy if you look carefully at them. I mean, the ones that still exist are really beat up, as you can imagine, and some have been rebuilt. But Martha Graham wasn't an established figure at that time either. I mean, she was still in the pioneer stage. So she didn't have a lot of money to spend either. So it was really productive. Later on, I guess that's late post-war, she tried to get him to do more things, but he was already involved with other projects. There is a book just on the theater sets called Dreamscapes or something like that. It's not very good. Someone named Tracy. No, it's a catalog of each one, but it really doesn't tell you.
I'll buy 2 of yours
No,
instead.
Deal.
Okay, we're back to this side now.
Marc, can you use the microphone?
I can. If I can get it. Sorry, did you get any of that? Normally I shout loud enough, but okay, we'll catch up with the next question. Yes.
Could you expand more into his approach to the play, particularly like their latest like play pieces in Atlanta? I think I'm more interested in to know how was his approach to play, if he was interested in like the play experience for children while he was designing those pieces.
They all vary. They all vary. He's certainly not a contextualist. All of these are like sculptures put onto the place. The California scenario used themes derived from California ecology, but not used the way they're used in nature, which I think is one of the lessons. You know, how they perform like natural systems. Doesn't have to look like natural systems. They copied nature. I mean, the two things that, and I think he understood that nature has that we don't have, is that it's got time and it's got extent. You know, a tall grass prairie that goes on for miles is quite something. When someone plants the same grass in their backyard, it's not a prairie restoration. It's a parterre, you know. But, and remember, a lot of these places you couldn't enter. You know, they were just enclosed spaces. But for each of them, and it's interesting, the playgrounds were the earliest conceptions, but of course, they can be criticized as playgrounds. They have some real problems to them, you know. So I thought, like in the Monument to the Plow, he's got some of the strip cropping running this way, which would only heighten erosion, you know. But I thought that, okay, he might be ignorant, but he's not stupid. That if the project went ahead, he'd have consultants to work on that. But for the most part, he's working independently. He's not calling on children's play consultants or ecological consultants, except, for example, there's Ken Kameyer at California Scenario, who established a palette for the cacti and desert plants, and then Noguchi selected from those and said, I want to use that, and I want to put it here, here, here. Those kind of things.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. Really fun to learn more about these gardens. I'm wondering on this track about his process. I recently saw a picture of him laying out California Scenario using like a stake or something like this and drawing on the land itself. I'm curious about how he used models and maybe on-site design in his design process.
There's not a lot I discovered with that. He did sketches, he did small-scale models. The landscape architect said when he went to the first model, Noguchi was coming back from Tokyo, and at the first presentation of the California Scenario was a small-scale model, I know the cardboard base, and then replicas, little models of each of the features, which Kameyer said he thinks he made out of Play-Doh that he got at the Tokyo airport. But when he was working on site, and there is a little video clip of California Scenario of Noguchi setting the stones. We know that when he's working on site, the projects tend to be much better than working through drawings. And so there, you know, and I mentioned that in the book, some of these projects that you can tell working drawings were done and then it was built. It just doesn't have the same feel, the same texture, and whatever, because it's going through a different iteration. Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Mark. What a fantastic lecture. I'm curious about the relationship between Noguchi and someone like Bunshaft at SOM. So with say Chase and Beinecke, I mean, was Bunshaft and SOM involved in the selection of Noguchi, and what was the collaborative relationship like?
I don't know for sure. I think once the relationship with Bunshaft was established, he just went to Noguchi. He said he's one of the few artists that really understands architecture. And Noguchi thought that Bunshaft was one of the few architects who wasn't a complete whatever. But it wasn't necessarily smooth. They were kind of frenemies. But there was a give or take between them. There's another one of those cubes on edge. You may have seen it's red cube in Lower Manhattan. And apparently for that site, in front of another bunch-up building, the Marine Midland, there's a little plaza, and first Noguchi proposed rocks, and Bunch-up said, look, I don't think that's appropriate. But he saw, and this was, I think, before or just after the Beinecke cube was done. So there was a give or take between them. He really didn't work with other architects, you know. I mean, he's still turning out thousands of objects. It's like no matter where you go, you kind of run into 5 Noguchis, you know. And of course, he was having assistants, especially in Japan, in Mure, since he was living in part of the stone yard. And then a very close connection with someone named Masatoshi Izumi. It was,
with me, but I was just curious as to Noguchi's education and what capacity he had that, because he has an eclectic range that's kind of phenomenal. And where does it come from?
Yeah, the bio is interesting. He took some art classes at a place called the Da Vinci School, not the Da Vinci Code, but the school in Manhattan. And the guy really was good at figurative modeling. In fact, during the Depression, he took on portrait sculptures that were commissioned. That was how he lived. But at the same time, he's doing abstract sculpture. He was kind of thinking of doing medical studies, and I think he made it through less than a year at Columbia. And then somehow, he got a Guggenheim, I think it was. It must have been one of the very early ones, that he was going to go around the world, basically, and looking at different themes in this. And he got as far as Paris, basically. And then for 6 months was with Brancusi. So he said he learned a lot about simplicity, as well as the technical things of cutting stone and all. But he's essentially self-educated. You could still go to Guggenheim if you were self-educated.
Thanks, Marc. I'm just more curious as to how do you come to experience one of Noguchi's landscape arts in person? Because a lot of how we perceive his art or works is through photography. But earlier on in your lecture, you mentioned how the first time you went to go see his work, it wasn't as, compelling as you thought. But then the second time you went, it was more attractive and got you thinking. Is it to do with the climate that you're in, or how do we even begin to kind of see his working experience like you did?
Well, certainly the light had a lot to do with it and the temperature, but maybe what I had for lunch, you never quite know. They say you can never step in the same river again. You're always a different person. And as I said, I thought gardens should have plants and trees, like Monet or something like that. But I think too often our opinions of a place, whether building or landscape, are determined by photographs. I mean, even more so now with the internet. And they're photographed under an ideal moment. Now, of course, photoshopped, so it's even, you can rely on them even less. And my students just never went to see anything. All that curiosity of seeing real stuff. And then if you drag them there, they were really excited, but they'd never do it on their own. They somehow thought everything's going to come to them on the internet rather than going out. And it's like people that are even architectural historians that are studying the publication policy of architectural form between 1952 and 1963. I said, why would you study that? You're not even doing archival work. You're just sitting in the library. You've been doing that for 5 or 6 years anyway. You don't get to travel and look at this stuff, And that's what makes it interesting. Of course, you have to have the means to travel, but grants and other things to get around. And you get excited by it. You know? I mean, I would never have thought of doing anything on Noguchi until I started seeing a couple of them. Then I make that mistake. Oh, I know enough. I've read the book, you know. And as the song goes, that's when the heartaches begin. You know? But no one else was doing it. So, I mean, almost all the things that I've worked on, no one else was doing it. So you can claim you did the definitive work, because no one else did anything. In fact, Inform has very kindly scraped together all the books of mine that they have, and they're all at the front desk. So they're little books, one called Austere Gardens, about simplicity, and one on poodling, which is kind of a topiary, as well as the more serious tomes. And they also said to say they will take orders for any additional books should they miraculously sell out. You can't live by doing these kind of books, by the way, if anyone's tempted. My wife and I used to say, it was like having a baby. You'd say, now can we really afford to do this book? But it has its own rewards. So. Anything? Are we wrapping up now? I guess. One more.
Thanks for the talk. Just wondering, as students and designers, what lessons we can take away from either his process or his approach and works, in your opinion, into our own work.
I know what I could. I can't say what you will. You know, it's a different thing. Are you looking for use of materials? Are you looking for spatial conceptions? You're looking to responses to sight. You're looking to perceptual phenomena, like the chase with which is a sunken cylindrical space. You can see from down below. Well, you learn something. What's the difference between seeing something from above and seeing it at eye level? I mean, I can't tell you what you should, you know. That's why you gotta go see it for yourself, as best you can. And some of these places now have films, which are certainly better than just static photographs. So.
I just wanted to comment, like it's true that, we're so used to like I remember when I was in Japan and someone was said to me he was so fascinated with the space. Well, I couldn't understand because I'm, coming in looking at the form. And so I think with Noguchi, like, as you say, you've got to be there to experience the space within the form. But my eye tends to go to the form. But now I can do both, the form and the space. And I don't think there's enough really teaching or whatever. I don't know how you could to really know what space is in art and design. That's, so thank you very much.
Well, it was big when I was in school, Everything was about space. That's a good modernist education. And to be honest, I first went to Japan because when I was in school, there were two lands of good design. There was Scandinavia and there was Japan. And I had to get out of where I was, and that was when I had first Fulbright, which got me to Finland, which was indelible how things changed. And then years passed, and I started teaching, and I said, okay, now it's time to go to Japan. So I went to Japan, and actually it was to look at folk architecture and castles. And then, of course, what was new architecture then, the kind of brutalist stuff, Kenzo Tange and Kunya Maekawa and others. But I also want to see the greatest hits, you have to go see the temples and stuff. And I remember once it was at Kendaruchi, I realized I'm not looking at the building, I'm looking through it. Because all the shoji were open and the Amado. I wonder what's behind it, And then, and of course the dry gardens are very easy for a modernist to appreciate, They're kind of reduced. They have a simple field and whatever, and that kind of led to my interest in landscape architecture, actually. was that single experience. So I think everyone's got a different way of approaching these things, but you know, Frank Lloyd Wright's got good writings on space. Still, I came around to it because when you start teaching, you either use the program you had or you react against it. Or some mixture maybe. And we had a book called Architecture as Space by Bruno Zevi. So when I was looking for text on space to teach beginning students, I couldn't use that book. You know, I had that book. But I tried a bunch of others and came back to it as still the best book on the subject. It's very readable. It was done in the 50s, I think. You know? So it's a real classic. But you don't hear much talk about space these days. And I think postmodernism kind of killed it. You know, when we went back to rooms, enfilade, and other, that's another story. Okay, going once, going twice.
For sale upstairs, and he will be signing copies for those of you who are interested in that. So thanks again for coming. Thank you, Marc. Thank you.